In November 1944, an American general stood on the west bank of the Rhine and saw something most wars almost never offer. A real opening. Not a theory, not a hope. An opening. Across the water was Germany. Behind that river were the Ruhr factories, the steel mills, the machinery that had kept the Wehrmacht armed for years. And on the far bank, in that narrow moment, the German defense was thin. Jacob Devers saw it. His staff saw it. His intelligence reports said it was there. So Devers asked for permission to cross. Eisenhower said no, not yet. Consolidate. Hold the line. Do not cross the Rhine. Devers did what he had always done. He obeyed. He did not call reporters. He did not make a public protest. He did not leave behind a dramatic accusation for historians to find. He pulled his men back from the eastern approaches and watched the window close. Week by week, the German side of the river hardened. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in force, it was March 1945. 4 months had passed. Whether Devers could have ended the war sooner is still debated. But the central fact is not. He found the opening. He was stopped from taking it. And then he stayed quiet while other men wrote the story. That is the strange shape of Jacob Devers' war. He built the machine for Europe. He lost the operation he helped prepare. He reached the river first. He was ordered to wait, and when memory turned into history, he let other men hold the pen. West Point, 1909. Jacob Laux Devers graduated in a class that would become one of the most extraordinary in American military history. George Patton was there, William Simpson was there, Robert Eichelberger was there. 4 men from that class would eventually wear 4 stars during the Second World War. Devers was one of them. But he did not become famous the way Patton became famous. He did not make command look theatrical. He did not perform for cameras. He did not build a public image out of speed, profanity, and spectacle. Devers chose field artillery. During the First World War, he did not fight in France. He taught doctrine at Fort Sill, and in the officer culture of that era, that mattered. Combat veterans carried a credential he did not have. But Devers carried something else. He could make complicated systems work. Coalitions, training pipelines, new weapons, short supplies, different national armies with different pride and different habits. Where other commanders generated friction, Devers usually generated movement. That was not glamorous. It was not the kind of gift that made a headline. But by 1941, the United States Army needed exactly that kind of man. At Fort Knox, Devers commanded the Army's armored force. He was helping build the doctrine for mechanized war before most Americans had seen what mechanized war would demand. He worked with industry. He pushed tank reliability. He shaped training. He helped turn armored warfare from an idea into an institution. And one of the officers under him was George Patton. Before Patton became the face of American armor, Devers was the senior man. Patton worked below him. Patton took orders from him. In 1941, if the Army was choosing between the public legend and the institutional builder, the builder had the higher office. That would change. But for a brief, important moment, the man history remembers most vividly was working under the man history would almost forget. Then came London. May 1943. General Frank Andrews, the American commander in the European theater, was killed in a plane crash over Iceland. Washington needed a replacement. It chose Jacob Devers. He arrived in Britain with a job that sounded administrative only to people who do not understand war. American divisions were pouring across the Atlantic: infantry, armor, air forces, engineers, logistics units, hospitals, depots, communications teams. They were arriving faster than Britain could absorb them. The invasion of France was no longer an idea on a planning table. It was becoming a physical machine. One dock, one camp, one convoy, one depot at a time. Devers had to help make that machine work. He dealt with British commanders. He managed American buildup. He handled competing priorities. He tried to make an army that had never attempted anything like this, ready for the largest amphibious operation in history. For 8 months, the senior American command in Europe belonged to him. 8 months. Not a footnote. Not a courtesy assignment. 8 months in the center of the coming invasion. Then Washington made the decision that would define the rest of his war. The Supreme Allied commander would be Dwight Eisenhower. When Eisenhower arrived, Devers moved out. The great invasion he had helped prepare would not carry his name. Not in public memory, not in the documentaries, not in the basic version every schoolchild would absorb. D-Day would belong to Eisenhower. The breakout would belong to the famous field commanders. Devers was sent south to the Mediterranean and given another job, a real job, an important job, but not the one he had spent months preparing. He would plan and command the invasion of southern France. Operation Dragoon. This is where many men would have revealed themselves. Some would have sulked. Some would have fought the transfer. Some would have sent letters to friends in Washington. Some would have made sure everyone knew they had been displaced. Devers did not. He accepted the assignment. He did not poison the relationship with Eisenhower. He did not use the press as a weapon. He did not create a public wound out of a private humiliation. That restraint would make him useful. It would also make him invisible. August 15th, 1944. While the world's attention still looked north toward Normandy, Devers' 6th Army Group came ashore on the Mediterranean coast of France. American and French forces pushed inland and then drove up the Rhine Valley. This was not a sideshow in the way memory often treats it. Southern France mattered. It opened ports. It pressured German forces from another direction. It helped stretch an enemy already losing control of the campaign. But it did not have the same mythology. The great names were elsewhere. Patton was racing across northern France. Eisenhower was managing the broad Allied advance. Paris had been liberated. Reporters followed the commanders with the biggest reputations and the most dramatic headlines. Devers kept moving. He commanded a coalition force, which meant he was not only fighting Germans. He was managing Americans and Frenchmen who carried different military cultures, different political pressures, and different national wounds. France had been occupied for years. French commanders were not simply attached to the campaign. They were fighting to restore their country's dignity in front of the world. That kind of coalition could have turned brittle. Under Devers, it functioned. He had the skill Marshall valued. He could hold difficult people inside a working structure without making every disagreement explode. That skill rarely photographs well, but armies survive on it. By autumn, Devers' forces were driving through Alsace. They took Strasbourg. They reached the Rhine. And that is where the story tightens. November 1944. The Rhine was not just another river. Every Allied planner understood what it meant. Cross it, and the Allied armies were inside Germany in a decisive way. Cross it, and the Ruhr came closer. Cross it, and the last great natural barrier before the German industrial heartland was no longer a barrier. The war might still be brutal, but the shape of the end would change. Devers believed the moment had arrived. The enemy across from him looked weak. The German units were depleted. The far bank was not yet locked into the kind of defense it would have later. He asked Supreme Headquarters for permission. Eisenhower refused. From Eisenhower's side, the refusal had logic. He believed in the broad front, no reckless thrust, no exposed spearhead across a major river, no one army group racing ahead while the others struggled to keep up. He had seen what happened when armies outran logistics. He had seen German counterattacks exploit gaps, flanks, and ambition. From the Supreme Commander's chair, Devers looked dangerous in a familiar way. Aggressive, fast-moving, too willing to see opportunity before all the risks had been boxed in. Eisenhower did not trust his judgment as much as Devers thought he should, so he held him back. But from Devers' side, this was the war offering a door, a narrow one. A temporary one. A door that would not stay open because wars do not hold still while headquarters debates. He had reached the river. He had the assessment. He had the chance. And the answer was no. This was the moment when a different kind of commander might have started building his case for history. A memo. A leak. A bitter diary entry. A network of allies who would remember his version. Devers did none of it. He obeyed the order. His men consolidated west of the river. German forces reinforced the east bank. The door closed. In March 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine in force. By then, the Germans had had months to prepare. That does not prove Devers would have ended the war in November. History is not that clean. But it does prove something about power. The man who sees the opening does not always become the man who explains the decision. Sometimes the man above him gets to stop him, and then gets to define him. Devers' war did not pause while that disappointment settled. On New Year's Eve, 1944, Germany launched Operation Nordwind. 9 German divisions struck into Alsace, trying to tear open the Allied southern flank and threaten the supply lines connected to Patton's operations in the Ardennes. Devers had warning through ultra-intelligence. He knew the blow was coming. His forces absorbed it through January. They held. They protected the southern flank while the Battle of the Bulge consumed the headlines farther north. There was no spectacular rescue scene for Devers to own. No single town that could stand in for the whole campaign. No easy movie moment. No line as famous as Bastogne. But that was exactly the point. A crisis did not become worse because Devers did his job. Then came the Colmar Pocket. In February 1945, his forces eliminated the German hold in Alsace that had sat like a thorn in the Allied line since autumn. Tens of thousands of German prisoners. Major equipment losses. A cleaner southern front. After that, Devers' army group drove into Germany and Austria as the war neared its end. He had commanded the southern third of the Allied advance. He had held a coalition together. He had protected the flank. He had absorbed a German offensive. He had cleared the pocket. He had reached the Rhine first. And still, in the story most people learned, he remained off to the side. Not absent, worse. Present but secondary. After the war, the second battle began. Not the battle for towns or bridges. The battle for memory. In 1948, Eisenhower published Crusade in Europe. It became one of the foundational accounts of the war in the West. It mattered because Eisenhower was not just another veteran telling his story. He had been the supreme commander. His version came with institutional gravity. In that version, the Rhine decision looked like responsible strategic control. Devers appeared as the subordinate whose energy needed restraint. The Southern Army Group appeared where Eisenhower's structure placed it, important but supporting. Then Omar Bradley published A Soldier's Story in 1951. Bradley's memoir placed the Northern armies and the Central Drive across Europe at the heart of the public narrative. First Army, Third Army, the 12th Army Group, the theater where the most remembered American commanders operated. That became the frame. And once a frame settles, later facts have to fight their way through it. The problem for Devers was not that Eisenhower and Bradley lied him out of history. The problem was subtler, more durable. They wrote the war from positions closer to the center of power, closer to the legend, and closer to the reading public. They explained decisions before Devers explained them. They gave future historians the first large architecture. And Devers did not answer with a memoir of equal force. He gave interviews. He spoke with historians. He preserved the professional tone he had carried through his life. Even decades later, when active service no longer required restraint, he was careful. He did not turn retirement into revenge. He did not publicly attack Eisenhower. He did not make the Rhine crossing the moral trial of his life. He did not build the Devers version and push it into the culture. He could have. He lived until 1979. He had more than 30 years after the major memoirs appeared to make his case. 30 years to say what he believed November 1944 had meant. 30 years to argue that the 6th Army Group deserved a different place in the story. 30 years to fight for the reputation other commanders fought for instinctively. He chose not to. Or maybe the same discipline that made him dependable in command made him unwilling to behave like a man campaigning for memory. That is the cruel part. The quality that made him valuable may have helped bury him. MacArthur understood the power of legend. Patton became unforgettable partly because he performed command as theater. Bradley wrote himself into the architecture of the war. Devers kept working. Then he kept quiet. He attended reunions. He gave oral histories. His papers went not to the grandest national stage, but to the Historical Society in York, Pennsylvania, his hometown. He watched the war harden into public memory. He watched Patton become a Hollywood figure. He watched Eisenhower become president. He watched Bradley remain one of the Central American voices of the European campaign. And he watched his own role shrink into specialist knowledge. known to military historians, known to serious students of the campaign, but not carried in the popular mind with the weight his command deserved. On the main American front across France and into Germany, Devers had commanded at army group level beside the names history made larger. He was not a corps commander having a good week. He was not a staff officer with a grievance. He commanded a major army group through one of the decisive campaigns of the war. James Scott Wheeler, the modern biographer who studied him in depth, judged Devers' contribution to Allied victory in Europe as second only to Eisenhower's. That is an astonishing assessment. But public memory does not always reward the man who contributed most. It often rewards the man who narrates best. So the 5 beats remain. He prepared Europe. He lost D-Day. He reached the Rhine. He got stopped. He stayed silent. Each beat by itself could be explained. Transfers happen. Strategy requires restraint. Memoirs have perspectives. Not every general becomes famous, but placed together they show the shape of a life spent near the center without being allowed to occupy the center of the story. Jacob Devers did almost everything the army asked of him. He built institutions before the war. He prepared forces before the invasion. He accepted displacement without public bitterness. He commanded a difficult coalition. He saw a possible opening at the Rhine. He obeyed when the answer was no. He kept fighting after the disappointment. He won the assignments given to him. And afterward, when the last campaign was not for territory but for memory, he treated silence like another order. That is why his story is not simply about being forgotten. Forgetting can happen by accident. Devers' case feels sharper than that. He was not erased in a single stroke. He was outranked, reassigned, denied, contained, then outwritten. The war ended. The books appeared. The famous men became permanent. And the general who reached the Rhine first became the kind of name people discover late, with surprise, and then wonder how he was ever left out. He had stood at the river before the others. But he did not cross into history first. He reached the Rhine before the men who became legends. Then the men who stopped him reached the page before he did.